We are very honored to have with us here today Dr. Christopher Ford, who, as you no doubt know, is the Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation at the U.S. Department of State, a position to which he was appointed in January this year. Prior to taking up his current position, Dr. Ford was the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counterproliferation at the United States National Security Council. Dr. Ford began his public service in 1996 as Assistant Counsel to the President's Intelligence Oversight Board, and in 2003 he joined the State Department as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Verification and Compliance. 3 years later, he was named U.S. Special Representative for Nuclear Non-Proliferation, where he was responsible for U.S. diplomacy in connection with the NPT Preparatory Committee meetings. In 2008, Dr. Ford moved to the Hudson Institute, where he worked as a senior fellow until 2013, when he returned to Congress, to the Hill, as we call it, where he served on a number of Senate committees, including the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. He's a graduate of Harvard University with a doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. Chris Ford is also a fellow jurist, having received his degree from Yale Law School. Earlier this spring, we celebrated 50 years since the opening for signature of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In 2 years, we will be convening the 10th NPT Review Conference on the occasion of the treaty's 50th birthday. The run-up to the 2020 Review Conference offers an excellent opportunity to reflect on how the NPT, the Iaea, and the non-proliferation regime writ large can continue to thrive in a complex and changing world. Chris, with his many years of experience in matters related to nuclear non-proliferation and his current senior position in the U.S. government, is well placed to share with us some thoughts on how the nuclear non-proliferation regime has learned from and adapted to in response to past experiences, and how it must continue to learn and adapt in order to preserve the security and other benefits that stem from the regime. Dr. Ford has agreed graciously to stay for a while and answer some questions we might have and have a little bit of a dialogue here. So without any further ado, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is it okay if I take the podium for this?
Please do.
So thank you for that. It is a pleasure to be here. And as Laura indicated, certainly this being the 50th anniversary already of the opening for signature of the NPT, it is a big year for thinking about the NPT and its future. As we do that thinking, we at the State Department in the US have emphasized the importance of remembering the benefits that have been provided for so long by the NPT and by the global non-proliferation regime that the international community has built up around that treaty. Now, memory and understanding of the past, we think, can be a key to helping unlock a better future. And we have stressed the linkage between understanding the NPT's legacy and the imperative of preserving and strengthening the non-proliferation regime so that it can continue to be of value. Now, this effort received a big boost from the NPT 50th Anniversary Depositories Conference that we held in Washington in June, and from the US, Russian, and British joint statement by the foreign ministers of those depository states. The joint statement that was issued at the time reaffirming on their country's behalf their commitment to the NPT in all of its aspects. In the months ahead, and leading up to the 2020 Review Conference, the 50th anniversary of the NPT's entry into force, as Laura has mentioned, we will continue to emphasize these themes and to build upon them. But remembering the benefits that the NPT provides, and of course which would be lost if the international community were to fail to preserve the non-proliferation architecture that is the treaty's core, that's not our only lesson, I would suggest, from the NPT's history. I believe we can also learn valuable things from the non-proliferation regime about how international organizations survive and thrive in a complex and changing world. And in particular, I believe we can profit tremendously from thinking a little bit more deeply about how the regime has been able to learn from its environment and adapt to changes in circumstances as that learning occurs. It's this process of regime learning that I am happy to be able to talk about today. So I'll offer 3 examples of successful learning, if you will, and 1 case of lessons that have not yet been fully learned. So the 3 success stories, if you will, are as follows. First of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the regime's ability to change course in working to ameliorate proliferation risks that the regime itself had inadvertently created in an earlier era by supporting the worldwide construction of research reactors fueled with highly enriched uranium. So that's the first success story that I'll talk about. The second one is the regime's ability to supplement traditional International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards with the additional protocol after it became clear that implementation, that's very kind of you, that implementation of comprehensive safeguards agreements was insufficient to provide creditable assurances against illicit nuclear activities. And the third case is the regime's development of increasingly effective, flexible, and efficient approaches to implementing safeguards agreements under the state-level concept. Now, the fourth case, the one of a lesson not yet fully learned, has to do with the regime's as yet inadequate and incomplete response to a case of announced withdrawal quite some time ago now, and the need to adopt principles and put in place measures to discourage such future withdrawals. Now, as I said, the first 3 of these are success stories for the regime. They demonstrate its ability to learn and to adapt and to keep itself from turning into the kind of rigid, static, and brittle institution that would, of course, all but inevitably collapse in a prolonged encounter with the real world. Remembering these instances of successful adaptation, I believe, can help focus us upon preserving these gains and preventing problems, ensuring that the non-proliferation regime can evolve in the face of today's challenges as well, and future challenges on top of that, so that all states party can continue to benefit from the NPT for another half-century and beyond. Now, that fourth example is unfortunately not yet a success story from which we can take such salutary lessons, but the foundation, we believe, for making it into a success story is still there, and perhaps we can see some movement on that as we move toward the 2020 Review Conference. So, first story, Heu minimization. The United States, of course, has been a key proponent of spreading nuclear technology for peaceful uses since the very beginning of the nuclear age. President Dwight Eisenhower, for one, spoke eloquently about this in his famous Atoms for Peace speech at the United Nations in 1953. And Article 4 of the NPT itself later incorporated language expressing possessor states' desire to facilitate nuclear cooperation. In the early years of the non-proliferation regime, supplier states were eager to share the benefits of peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and they helped a number of developing countries build research or experimental reactors that ran on HEU fuel. Now, of course, as we know from other spheres of life, not all things that are done with good intentions and great enthusiasm are always done wisely or well. And in time, it became clear that this HEU-based approach wasn't such a good idea. One can make a perfectly good research or power reactor with low-enriched uranium, after all. And it is in the nature of the enrichment process that purifying U-235 above 20% levels accomplishes the lion's share of the work in enrichment that it is necessary to do in order to get to weapons-usable levels. As a result, spreading HEU around the world increased both the ease with which a host government could divert material for weapons purposes in a breakout scenario, and the quantity of dangerous material that could be subject to loss or theft. But this is where regime learning comes in. It is important always to keep a careful eye on the consequences of one's initiatives and to be able and willing to readjust them as necessary as one's understanding improves. And thankfully, thanks in large part to U.S. leadership and support from the American taxpayer to the tune of approximately $8 billion, the non-proliferation regime has been able, in more recent decades, to help reduce the risks created by those early HEU enthusiasms of the Atoms for Peace era. In light of improved understanding of proliferation risks, extensive work, as many of you will be very familiar with, has been done to develop replacement LEU fuel for HEU reactors, to convert HEU reactors and medical isotopic production to LEU operations, and to repatriate both fresh and spent HEU fuel to its country of origin. Since its inception 40 years ago now, the U.S. Reduced Enrichment for Research and Test Reactors program has helped convert more than 40 research and test reactors from HEU to LEU. Since 2004, the Global Threat Reduction Initiative, now called Material Management and Minimization, or M-cubed, one to be a little cute about it, I suppose, has managed a broad and intensive effort to support LEU fuel development, reactor conversion, and HEU repatriation all around the world. GTRI has targeted reactors around the world, including over a dozen in the United States itself, for conversion or shutdown by 2020, in time for the review conference. And as of today, it has verified the conversion or shutdown of almost 100 facilities that had previously used HEU, about a third of them weaning off of HEU since 2009 alone. Fuel repatriation efforts have returned 4,500 kilograms or so of HEU to points of origin in Russia and the United States for downblending and disposition. Now, in terms of U-235 content, the majority of this material has been returned to the US, but Russia has also done its part, working with 16 countries to do this, as a good example of the ways in which shared interests can still drive important cooperative projects, notwithstanding the challenges in broader relationships. As part of this work on repatriation, the US has been taking back irradiated and fresh HEU fuel from US-supplied research reactors and partner countries, as well as assisting with the repatriation of some Chinese and UK-supplied HEU, and indeed also several hundred kilograms of plutonium that had similarly been used for peaceful research purposes. Now, in the case of Japan's fast critical assembly, which no longer had a need for HEU and plutonium, Japan itself sent back more than 500 kilograms of these materials to the United States in early 2016 in the form of small metal fuel coupons. In total, more than 40 countries have been cooperating with these repatriation efforts, and as a result, 33 countries and Taiwan have now become HEU-free, 12 of them by repatriating HEU that had been supplied by Russia. This has been, as these figures clearly show, a very impressive effort. And while this is a problem that one might wish one had not had to solve, the non-proliferation regime has indeed done considerable good work and has made great progress in solving it, in reducing the proliferation risks created in past years when its enthusiasm for sharing outran its non-proliferation good sense. And it's done all of this without cutting back on long-standing efforts to share the benefits of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Indeed, those efforts have accelerated. We should remember this, I think, as a lesson. These risk reduction successes have helped the non-proliferation regime survive and to continue to provide the benefits that it does to all mankind, notwithstanding some dubious non-proliferation choices that were made in times before. Appreciating this story, I would argue, can help the international community remain alive to the need to reassess its own practices on an ongoing basis in the years ahead, and to adjust approaches as needed as our understanding of proliferation risks continues to mature. So that's the first story. The second success story is the IAEA Additional Protocol. Specifically, its approval in 1997 and its subsequent emergence as the global standard for nuclear safeguards. Now, the principal catalyst for this learning, of course, you will recall, was Iraq, which began its own clandestine efforts to develop nuclear weapons in the early 1970s, at the direction of a fellow that we heard a little bit more about later, the then head of the Iraqi Atomic Energy Commission by the name of Saddam Hussein. By 1991, Iraq had a robust covert nuclear weapons program that included a complete nuclear weapons design and a supply of HEU in the form of research reactor fuel. Iraq also had a secret effort to enrich uranium using the same calutron-based electromagnetic isotope separation techniques that the United States had used to enrich uranium for the Hiroshima bomb during the Manhattan Project. Now, despite all this Iraqi work, the IAEA continued to draw positive conclusions about Iraq's safeguards compliance. And this was true because the agency's implementation of comprehensive safeguards agreements, including Iraq's, focused only upon verifying what the state had declared to the IAEA rather than looking for indications of undeclared activities. Now, although the model for such agreements set out in INCIRC 153 provides some authority to look for undeclared activities anyway, particularly through special inspections, the IAEA had allowed this authority to fall into disuse. And instead, by that point, the IAEA only sought to verify the accuracy of what Iraq chose to declare. And naturally, the Iraqis carefully declined to declare their clandestine weapons program and their enrichment work to the IAEA, with the result that the agency appeared to give Iraq a clean bill of health for many years, thus, in effect, inadvertently helping provide cover for the clandestine weapons program. Now, of course, the true nature of Iraq's program became painfully clear to the international community after Saddam Hussein's military defeat in the 1991 war, as did, alas, the manifest inadequacy of the IAEA's then approach to implementing comprehensive safeguards agreements. But here's where we return to my theme of regime learning. Because in response to revelations about the weaknesses in safeguards implementation, the IAEA pursued a 2-year review of safeguards implementation, known as Program 93+2, which examined both ways it could better use its existing authority and possible new authorities that it could use to improve its ability to detect and to deter undeclared nuclear activities. The first part of this effort led the Board of Governors to reaffirm its guidance that CSAs should be designed to verify that states' declarations are both correct and complete in order to provide creditable assurances, both that declared nuclear material is not diverted and that there are no undeclared nuclear activities in the state as a whole. This guidance was based upon the agency's earlier experience, not just with Iraq, but also in South Africa, where both the Board of Governors and the General Conference had asked the Secretariat to verify the completeness of South Africa's initial declaration. Now, the second part of Program 93+2 considered new legal authority that the agency could use to draw stronger conclusions about the absence of undeclared activities, and it ultimately led to the negotiation of the Model Additional Protocol, the AP. It requires states, of course, to provide more extensive declarations about nuclear-related activities, and it gives the Iaea broader access, including at undeclared locations, to verify declarations or to resolve questions or inconsistencies regarding those declarations. The Iaea has used this tool effectively to investigate indications of possible undeclared activities in response to acquisition of appropriate evidence in many countries around the world. Indeed, this is now accepted practice of access. Not only it strengthens the non-proliferation regime by providing the Iaea with valuable information, but it also adds a deterrent value, as I indicated before, since now a would-be proliferator understands that he or she faces a much higher risk of being caught. Since the development of the AP in 1997, it has become the world's standard for nuclear safeguards. Not only has it been signed by 148 countries and brought into force by 132 of them, but it is the basis for the Iaea to draw the so-called broader conclusion, a formal determination that creditable investigations have found no indication of undeclared activities in the state in question, and a finding on this basis that all nuclear material has indeed been placed under safeguards. Even NPT weapon states have adopted versions of the AP that apply to some or all of their civilian nuclear sectors, as we in the United States did in 2009. Provisional application of the AP, even in Iran, currently provides an essential part of the IAEA's inspection authorities there, and it is a critical tool for monitoring Iran's compliance with its nuclear obligations and in helping increase the chances that the IAEA would detect any resumption of Iran's past nuclear weapons work. So the AP has been a vital addition to nuclear safeguards, and it has helped reinforce the regime, helping it survive in face of the challenges that it has confronted. We owe the AP's existence to regime learning. To be sure, the additional protocol's story is not yet fully told, for a handful of countries still resist it, and not always for creditable reasons. But the AP does represent safeguards best practices to which it has been clear for more than 2 decades that all countries should adhere. And support for the AP today has become something of a litmus test for seriousness and responsible behavior in the realm of civil nuclear cooperation. As President Trump said in his message to the IAEA General Conference, delivered by Secretary of Energy Rick Perry on Monday, we will continue promoting high standards of safety, security, safeguards, and non-proliferation, including an additional protocol as the international standard, and call upon other nations to do the same. Consistent with this message, of course, the AP should be universalized, and all supplier states should make adherence to the AP by recipient states a condition for nuclear supply. So the AP is another success story of the non-proliferation regime learning in practice, of a problem being recognized, and remedial steps being taken by responsible states to help preserve the regime and thereby ensure that all states party continue to enjoy its benefits. So that's success story number 2. Number 3, another challenge the IAEA has faced is how best to implement safeguards agreements after they have been negotiated between the agency and individual countries. How could the IAEA plan, implement, and evaluate its safeguards work, either under traditional CSA authorities or involving the AP? How could it do these things without either stretching scarce agency resources to the breaking point or becoming an unwarrantedly intrusive burden upon states that are subject to safeguards? The IAEA's answer to this challenge is something known as the state-level concept, which began as an effort to optimize the implementation of safeguards in states where the agency has drawn a broader conclusion by taking into account the agency's enhanced knowledge of the nuclear activities and capabilities of a state. But the concept applies equally to a state with any safeguards agreement. Its implementation represents another success story in the regime's ongoing struggle to adapt itself to the challenges of doing its job in a complicated world so that the NPT can continue to provide national security and peaceful use benefits to all. Under the state-level concept, the SLC, the IAEA has been developing more systematic ways of addressing investigative resources to achieve safeguards objectives in the service of our collective non-proliferation goals, first and foremost by developing a sophisticated understanding of the nuclear program in each country that is subject to safeguards. These approaches are more nuanced than I probably understand and certainly than I can explain here. But it involves, among other things, something called acquisition path analysis, which closely analyzes all viable pathways by which a single given state might acquire nuclear material, whether by diverting it or producing it clandestinely for a potential nuclear weapon. This analysis is informed by all safeguards relevant information, including what is coming to be some very impressive open source research capabilities, and then it uses these insights to target inspection resources as efficiently as possible in the field. The answer for each country is tailored to that particular country's circumstances and the terms of each country's safeguards agreement, and it is implemented in a non-discriminatory way based upon objective criteria and information in very close coordination and cooperation with each member state, with the aim of ensuring that safeguards implementation is as effective as possible, optimizes the agency's limited resources within each state, and avoids what might otherwise have had to be a rigid system merely of intrusive and burdensome box-checking exercises at every conceivable nuclear location. The SLC is a sophisticated approach to fulfilling the IAEA's existing safeguards mandate, one that has been many years in the making, and so far implementation seems to be going very well. Fears that it would lead the agency to exceed its authority or to apply it unevenly or unfairly have proven entirely unfounded, thankfully. There is, in my view, no good reason for any state to oppose it, for it is a critical part of how the IAEA does its job in implementing safeguards agreements in ways that are as effective and as little burden upon states as possible. Efforts to undermine the state-level concept by calling into question the agency's authority or its objectivity are in fact a danger to the non-proliferation regime and to its ability to continue to provide peaceful use benefits. So the SLC is another case study then of the non-proliferation regime successfully adapting to the challenges of a complex world and of the international community's maturing understanding of how most effectively to provide the non-proliferation assurances that peaceful nuclear sharing requires. Trust me, I'm almost done. The fourth case, however, is the not quite so comfortable case, an example of a lesson not yet fully learned. So let me talk about it a little bit and suggest some principles that we can apply to learning and adapting in light of this case as well. In 2003, as we all know, North Korea formally announced its withdrawal from the NPT. It took this action after it had been found in noncompliance with its safeguards agreement, initially in 1993 for refusing a special inspection after it made an incomplete initial declaration, and later, in 2003, for expelling IAEA inspectors after U.S. intelligence discovered that Pyongyang was pursuing an undeclared uranium enrichment program. North Korea is the first and only country to announce its withdrawal from the treaty, and its action raised a number of issues that have not yet been resolved to this day, 15 years and 3 NPT review conferences later. These lessons are broadly recognized, but consensus on concrete responses has still so far proven elusive. First, the withdrawal of any state undermines the security benefits that all other states derive from the nearly universal adherence to the non-proliferation obligations of the NPT, particularly if, as in the case of North Korea, the withdrawing state goes on to manufacture nuclear weapons. That raises questions within the competency of the Security Council, of course, which is responsible for maintaining international peace and security. But indeed, in the Security Council, in Resolution 1887, decided that it would address without delay any future notice of withdrawal from the NPT. That's something, but we have many questions left unanswered here. There are also particular implications for enforcing compliance with the NPT. We would live in a much more dangerous world, of course, if states could violate their non-proliferation obligations and escape the consequences of those actions simply by withdrawing from the treaty when caught with their hand in the proverbial cookie jar. Fortunately, it is a basic principle of international law that withdrawing from a treaty does not affect any right, obligation, or legal situation of the parties created through the execution of the treaty prior to its termination. One logical consequence of this is that a withdrawing state remains responsible under international law for violations of the treaty committed prior to its withdrawal. This principle is widely recognized by NPT parties, but it has not yet commanded full consensus. A third issue is whether the withdrawing state can divert the nuclear materials, equipment, facilities, and know-how that it gained through peaceful nuclear cooperation while a party to the NPT, and then use them to manufacture nuclear weapons after withdrawal. Will safeguards continue to apply on nuclear material, equipment, and facilities supplied by another NPT party? The existing international guidelines for nuclear export control, codified in the Nuclear Suppliers Group guidelines, address these issues from the perspective of the rights and responsibilities of the supplying state. The guidelines say that suppliers should get assurances from recipient governments that those items will remain under safeguards and not be used for nuclear explosives, or else the supplier may demand their return. If such conditions were applied universally and enforced reliably, they could help prevent states from misusing the withdrawal provision of the NPT in this manner in the future. Now, it seems that many of the elements needed to help address the possibility of withdrawal from the NPT are already in place, and many NPT parties have sponsored papers. I've seen many of them across my desk in the last several years. I've been tracking these issues since we first started to struggle with this back in 2003, when North Korea announced its withdrawal. Yet, despite all this work, NPT parties have still been unable to reach consensus on these principles or on specific recommendations. Some have objected to actions that would limit the ability of states to exercise withdrawal provisions of the NPT, even though none of those proposals would in fact have that effect. Oddly, some have even gone so far as to claim that withdrawal is not a serious issue anyway, seemingly oblivious to the concrete example of North Korea that stares us in the face with every day's morning headlines, and despite Iran's periodic recent mutterings about the possibility of its own withdrawal. Now, on this issue of withdrawal, unlike any of my previous 3 case studies I've been speaking to today, the non-proliferation regime clearly has not yet fully learned or adapted based upon the lessons of its experience. All the necessary ingredients, we think, are present, but despite widespread support for action, this consensus has remained elusive. We should not consider this a failure or a lost cause, but as a task that remains incomplete, and I think this should be an important area for progress as we head toward the 2020 Review Conference. So, in conclusion, there are other stories of successful adaptation, of course, to which one could point. But I think these 3 success stories that I've mentioned, Heu Minimization, the additional protocol, and the state-level concept, those are my favorites. They demonstrate that the non-proliferation regime is not, do you want me to go for an hour and a half? Oh my God. The regime is not as ossified and brittle and static as one might have feared that it would become. Instead, it has shown itself in these cases to be a dynamic one that has been repeatedly capable of meeting challenges and learning from its past mistakes or omissions. The 4th case of NPT withdrawal is a cautionary example that demonstrates that such learning is not easy and not necessarily quick either, and certainly not automatic. It shows that we cannot be complacent about such challenges, and that the resilience of the nuclear non-proliferation regime depends upon hard work on a continuing basis by responsible countries to bring themselves together to shore up this regime in many areas, and in any area that they see of weakness, and as the understandings of these challenges occur. We hope that this will allow us to show vibrancy so that the regime can continue to learn and to adapt, and that my successors at the State Department will be able to tell even more stories to audiences like this in the future. I want to highlight one important feature of these cases. Each one provides a concrete example that it is possible to strengthen the non-proliferation regime without impeding the peaceful uses of nuclear energy that are also a key focus of our work, for example, here in Vienna. Indeed, despite complaints from some developing countries that constantly escalating non-proliferation conditions have had the effect of infringing upon their rights to benefit from peaceful uses, the effect is quite the contrary. The opposite is true. Just as backward steps in ensuring that the non-proliferation regime meets the challenges that it faces might endanger progress on peaceful uses, each step forward on non-proliferation builds confidence and helps to advance the mission of the Iaea to accelerate and enlarge the contribution of atomic energy to peace, health, and prosperity throughout the world. And at each step forward helps facilitate, as the NPT put it, the fullest possible exchange of nuclear material, equipment, and technology for peaceful purposes. The application of nuclear energy and science and technology for peaceful purposes has been a tremendous boon to people around the world. It has provided clean, reliable electricity generation. It has helped diagnose and treat cancer and other diseases, control disease-carrying pests, and meet the basic human needs of all sorts that are too diverse to even begin to go into here today. All of this is possible because of the controls that we have collectively put in place to limit the risks from these technologies, including the risk of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. These benefits are, in a very concrete sense, the fruits of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Ensuring that the regime remains resilient is the best way to preserve and expand those benefits for future generations. It is exciting to be a part of a regime that has provided so much benefit to so many people for so long, and that has been able to learn and to adapt so well. And with apologies to George Santayana, I think it is important to remember this history precisely so that we can repeat it, in the sense that because we want the non-proliferation regime to continue to provide those benefits for all, we should work to ensure that that regime can continue to adapt and to evolve in the future, as these examples demonstrate that it has been able to do in the past. Such regime learning and adaptation is something for us all to continue to aspire to. So we should commit ourselves, again, and for always, to preserving these gains, and I call upon all of you to repudiate any effort to undermine the advances being made in Heu minimization, in universalizing the additional protocol, and in implementing the state-level concept. Upon this golden anniversary of the NPT's opening for signature, and informed by its rich history, we should dedicate ourselves to ensuring that the regime will be able to adapt to future challenges just as successfully as it has been able to do in the past. Thank you very much.